The morning sun cast long shadows across Edwards Air Force Base as crowds gathered beneath billowing American flags and pristine aircraft displays. The International Defense Expo had transformed the usually quiet base into a bustling showcase of military might and technological innovation. Dignitaries in pressed uniforms mingled with defense contractors in expensive suits, while camera crews positioned themselves for optimal shots of the day's main attraction. Jack Rylan stood at the edge of the crowd, his weathered hands resting gently on his 10-year-old daughter Emma's shoulders. His faded jeans and worn flannel shirt marked him as distinctly civilian among the sea of military dress blues and corporate blazers. The contrast wasn't lost on him. 5 years ago, he would have been on the other side of those security barriers, ensuring every bolt and wire was perfect for a demonstration like this. "Dad, look at that one!" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma pointed excitedly at a sleek fighter jet, its polished surface gleaming like liquid mercury in the desert sun. Her eyes sparkled with the same wonder that had once driven Jack to enlist, back when he believed machines could touch the sky and carry dreams with them. Jack followed her gaze, his practiced eye automatically cataloging the aircraft specifications. "That's an F-35. Lightning II," he said softly, memories flooding back of similar machines he'd once maintained with meticulous care. "Single-engine multi-role fighter. Top speed Mach 1.6. "How do you know all that?" Emma asked, tilting her head up at him with a kind of unquestioning admiration that both warmed and worried him. She'd been too young to remember him in uniform, too young to understand why he'd left the Air Force after her mother's passing. "Just something I picked up along the way," he replied, unwilling to revisit those ghosts in this moment of shared wonder. The crowd's attention shifted as a convoy of black SUVs approached, their occupants emerging with the practiced precision of a military operation. General Elias Grant stepped out of the lead vehicle, his silver hair catching the light beneath his service cap. Even at 62, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who'd never met a problem he couldn't solve through discipline and determination. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests," General Grant's voice boomed across the airfield through strategically placed speakers. "Welcome to what promises to be a historic day for American aerospace technology." Jack watched the general with a mixture of respect and melancholy. He'd served under men like Grant, officers who carried the weight of national security on their shoulders and made it look effortless. The kind of leader who inspired mechanics like Jack to work 18-hour days to keep their birds flying. "Today you'll witness the first public demonstration of Falcon's Pride," Grant continued, gesturing toward a hangar whose doors were slowly rolling open. "This experimental aircraft represents 5 years of development and the finest engineering minds in our military-industrial complex." As the hangar doors revealed their contents, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Falcon's Pride emerged like something from a science fiction film, all curves and angles that seemed to defy conventional aircraft design. Its hybrid propulsion system promised to revolutionize military aviation, combining the efficiency of electric motors with the raw power of advanced turbofan engines. Emma squeezed Jack's hand. "It looks like it's from the future, Dad." "It kind of is, sweetheart," Jack murmured, his engineer's mind already working through the visible systems. Even from their distant vantage point, he could see the complexity of the aircraft's design, the intricate network of fuel lines, the sophisticated sensor arrays, the delicate balance of form and function that made flight possible. Dr. Serena Cade emerged from behind the aircraft, her confident stride matching her reputation as one of the most brilliant aerospace engineers of her generation. At 38, she'd already revolutionized flight control systems and held 17 patents in propulsion technology. Her tailored blue blazer and perfectly styled black hair projected an image of unshakable competence. "The Falcon's Pride incorporates revolutionary hybrid technology," she announced to the gathered crowd, her voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "We've achieved a 60% reduction in fuel consumption while maintaining superior performance characteristics. This aircraft doesn't just represent the future of military aviation, it embodies it." Colonel Victor Stroud stood beside the aircraft, his chest adorned with ribbons and medals that caught the morning light. His smile was practiced, political, the expression of a man who'd learned to perform confidence even when he felt none. "The implications for our national defense capabilities cannot be overstated," he declared. This aircraft will ensure American air superiority for the next generation. Jack felt a familiar twinge in his chest, part pride, part loss. He'd once been part of teams that made moments like this possible, ensuring that every system worked flawlessly when the world was watching. Now he was just another face in the crowd, his expertise reduced to keeping civilian cars running in his small garage 50 miles from here. "When will they start it up?" Emma asked, bouncing slightly on her toes with excitement. "Soon, I think," Jack replied, though something in the positioning of the ground crew caught his attention. There was tension in their movements, the subtle urgency that suggested not everything was going according to plan. His trained eye picked up the small signs others missed. Technicians double-checking connections, engineers huddled in quick conversations, the careful choreography of troubleshooting disguised as routine preparation. The media crews pressed closer, their cameras focused on every detail. International observers from allied nations watched with keen interest, their presence adding weight to an already high-stakes demonstration. Jack could feel the pressure emanating from the official party, the weight of national prestige balanced on the performance of a single machine. As the crowd settled into anticipation, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to witness something that would change more than just military aviation. In the distance, Falcon's Pride sat waiting, beautiful and silent, holding secrets that would soon be revealed to a watching world. The crowd fell silent as Dr. Serena Cade raised her hand, signaling the beginning of the demonstration. All eyes focused on Falcon's Pride as its ground crew made final preparations, their movements precise and rehearsed. The weight of expectation hung heavy in the desert air, thick as the heat shimmer rising from the tarmac. Initiating startup sequence, Serena announced into her headset, her voice carrying across the airfield through the speaker system. The confidence in her tone was absolute. This was her moment, the culmination of years of theoretical work transformed into gleaming reality. Jack instinctively tightened his grip on Emma's hand as the aircraft's systems began their awakening process. Status lights flickered to life across Falcon's Pride's sleek fuselage, creating a constellation of amber and green against the polished metal surface. The crowd held its collective breath, cameras capturing every second of what was supposed to be a triumphant moment. The first indication of trouble was subtle, a hesitation in the startup sequence that Jack's trained ear caught immediately. Where there should have been the smooth progression of systems coming online, there was a stuttering uncertainty. The main engines remained ominously quiet. Attempting restart, Serena's voice came through the speakers, though Jack could detect the first note of concern beneath her professional composure. She turned to confer with her chief engineer Marcus Chen, whose tablet displayed arrays of diagnostic data that clearly weren't showing what they expected. Colonel Stroud maintained his political smile, but Jack noticed the tightening around his eyes. "Just a minor calibration issue," he announced to the crowd, his voice carrying forced joviality. "These advanced systems require precise initialization." But Jack knew better. The subtle wrongness in the engine's behavior spoke to something deeper than calibration. He'd heard that particular combination of system responses before. In Afghanistan, when a hydraulic pump on his F-16 had failed during pre-flight, creating a cascade of seemingly unrelated problems that had taken hours to diagnose. "Dad, why isn't it starting?" Emma whispered, her excitement beginning to give way to concern as the delays stretched beyond what even civilian observers might consider normal. "Sometimes machines need a little coaxing," Jack replied, but his attention was focused entirely on the aircraft. From their position in the crowd, he could see technicians swarming around Falcon's Pride's engine bays, their body language speaking volumes about the frustration building behind the professional facades. The second attempt produced the same results. Systems initializing, diagnostics showing green across the board, but the engines remaining stubbornly silent. A murmur began to ripple through the crowd as media representatives exchanged glances and international observers checked their phones with increasing frequency. General Grant stepped forward, his expression carved from granite. "Dr. Cade, status report." Serena's response was barely audible to the crowd, but Jack caught fragments. "All systems nominal, fuel flow verified, electrical systems responsive." Each phrase was delivered with the precision of someone trying to convince themselves as much as their audience. Marcus Chen emerged from beneath the aircraft, his usually immaculate appearance now showing signs of the frantic troubleshooting taking place out of public view. Oil stained his white shirt, and his hair was disheveled from crawling through cramped access panels. He shook his head grimly at Serena. Whatever they'd hoped to find in the physical systems hadn't materialized. "Perhaps we're being too hasty," Colonel Stroud announced, his smile now clearly forced. "Advanced propulsion systems require a methodical approach to ensure optimal performance." But even as he spoke, Jack could see sweat beading on the colonel's forehead despite the morning's relative coolness. The third attempt was met with the same result. This time, the crowd's murmur grew louder, and Jack noticed camera crews repositioning themselves to capture, not triumph, but what was increasingly looking like a very public failure. Defense contractors in the VIP section were having hushed conversations, their expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed satisfaction at a competitor's misfortune. Emma tugged on Jack's sleeve. "Dad, you fixed our car when it wouldn't start. Could you fix that plane?" The innocent question hit Jack like a physical blow. His daughter's unquestioning faith in his abilities was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. She didn't understand the vast gulf between keeping a 10-year-old Honda running and diagnosing problems in a $100 million experimental aircraft surrounded by the military's top engineers. "It's not that simple, sweetheart," Jack said gently. "That plane has systems I've never worked on, and there are a lot of very smart people trying to figure out what's wrong." But even as he spoke the words, Jack's mind was working through possibilities. The pattern of failure was familiar, even if the technology was advanced. Engines that received all the right signals but refused to start typically suffered from one of a few root causes: fuel delivery problems, ignition system failures, or computer interface issues that prevented proper system integration. From his position in the crowd, Jack watched the technicians' increasingly frantic efforts. They were following diagnostic protocols, checking each system in isolation, but he could see they were missing something fundamental. The way the status lights flickered during startup attempts suggested an intermittent connection somewhere in the control system, the kind of problem that would show green on diagnostics but fail under operational load. "This is becoming embarrassing," said a man in an expensive suit standing near them, his voice carrying the dismissive tone of someone accustomed to corporate boardrooms where failure meant stock prices dropped. 5 years and $300 million for an aircraft that won't even start." The comment stung Jack more than it should have. He'd seen good aircraft grounded by problems that seemed insurmountable until someone looked at them from a different angle. The difference between success and failure often came down to perspective, and sometimes the most experienced eyes were the ones that had seen the most failures. Dr. Serena Cade stepped away from the aircraft, her professional composure finally beginning to crack. She gestured animatedly at her tablet while speaking rapid-fire instructions to her team. Marcus Chen nodded and disappeared back into the aircraft's bowels, carrying tools that suggested they were moving beyond diagnostics into actual repairs. General Grant's expression remained impassive, but Jack could read the tension in his posture. This wasn't just about a machine failing to start. It was about national prestige on display before international allies and potential adversaries. Every minute that Falcon's Pride sat silent was a minute of American technological superiority being questioned. "Fourth attempt in 30 seconds, Serena announced, her voice now carrying an edge of desperation that no amount of professional training could fully conceal. As the crowd waited in increasingly uncomfortable silence, Jack found himself studying not just the aircraft but the people surrounding it. The technicians, the engineers, the officials, all brilliant individuals at the top of their respective fields, but all trapped by the same conventional thinking that had led to this moment. Sometimes, Jack thought, the solution required looking at the problem from an entirely different perspective. Jack stepped slightly away from the main crowd, finding a position behind a display board where he could observe without drawing attention. Emma followed, her small hand still clasped in his, her earlier excitement now replaced by the kind of focused curiosity that reminded him so much of her mother. Sarah had possessed the same ability to see beyond surface appearances, to find meaning in moments others might dismiss. "Dad, you're making that face," Emma whispered, looking up at him with knowing eyes. "What face?" Jack asked, though he suspected he knew what she meant. "The same face you make when Mrs. Henderson's car makes that weird noise, like you're listening to something no one else can hear." Jack smiled despite the tension of the moment. His daughter was more perceptive than most adults he knew. She was right. He was listening, his trained ear picking up subtle audio cues from Falcon's Pride that the public address system wasn't filtering out. From their slightly elevated position behind the display, Jack could see details that weren't visible to most of the crowd. The way the aircraft's navigation lights flickered during startup attempts. The pattern of technician movements around the engine bays. The frustrated gestures of engineers who were finding exactly what their diagnostics told them they should find, yet somehow missing the real problem. "It's not the engines," Jack murmured, more to himself than to Emma. "What's not the engines?" she asked, her voice carrying that particular mixture of genuine curiosity and absolute trust that made his heart ache. Jack knelt down to her level, pointing discreetly toward the aircraft. "See how the lights on the wings flicker when they try to start it? If the engines themselves were broken, that wouldn't happen. The problem is somewhere else. Something that's telling the engines not to start." Emma studied the aircraft with the same intensity she brought to her homework, her young mind absorbing information with the rapid processing that children seem to possess naturally. Like when our garage door opener wouldn't work, but the problem was the remote control? "Exactly like that," Jack said, impressed by her analogy. Sometimes, the thing that seems broken isn't actually broken at all. They watched as Dr. Serena Cade consulted with another team of engineers, her tablet displaying cascading data that seemed to confirm every system was functioning perfectly. Marcus Chen emerged from the aircraft once again, oil-stained and increasingly frazzled, shaking his head in obvious frustration. "Dad," Emma said quietly, "why don't you tell them what you think?" The question hit Jack like cold water. Tell them what he thought. He was a civilian mechanic who fixed cars in a small-town garage, not an aerospace engineer with advanced degrees and security clearances. What possible contribution could he make to solving a problem that had stumped some of the most brilliant minds in military aviation? "Sweetheart, those people are experts. They have equipment and knowledge I don't have. They'll figure it out." But even as he spoke, Jack's mind was working through the technical possibilities. The intermittent flickering suggested a loose connection or a software interface problem, something that would pass static diagnostics but fail under the dynamic conditions of actual operation. In his experience, those kinds of problems were often overlooked because they didn't fit the expected failure modes that engineers were trained to look for. Emma was quiet for a moment, then reached into her small backpack and pulled out a photograph. It was a picture of Jack and her mother, taken during happier times when Sarah was still alive, and the future seemed full of possibilities. In the photo, Jack wore his Air Force uniform, his expression confident and purposeful. "Mom always said you could fix anything," Emma said softly, her finger tracing the edge of the photograph. "She said you had magic hands that could make machines sing." The memory hit Jack like a physical blow. Sarah had indeed said those words, usually after watching him diagnose a problem that had stumped other mechanics. She'd believed in his abilities with the kind of absolute faith that made him feel capable of achieving anything. Her death had taken more than just a wife and mother. It had taken the person who saw potential in him that he couldn't see in himself. "That was a long time ago, Em," Jack said gently. "I'm not that person anymore." "Yes, you are," she replied with the unwavering certainty that only children possessed. "You're still the same dad who fixes everything that breaks. You're just sadder now." From their position, they could hear fragments of increasingly heated discussions among the technical team. Words like impossible and unprecedented drifted across the airfield, along with a kind of technical jargon that Jack recognized as the language of people who were running out of conventional options. Colonel Stroud was speaking urgently with General Grant, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. The media crews were repositioning themselves again, sensing that the story was evolving beyond a simple technical demonstration into something more significant. International observers were making phone calls, their expressions suggesting that America's technological superiority was being questioned in real time. Fourth attempt yielded identical results, Dr. Cade announced, her professional composure now showing visible cracks. "We're initiating emergency diagnostic protocols." Emergency diagnostic protocols. Jack knew what that meant. They were moving beyond standard troubleshooting into territory that suggested fundamental problems with the aircraft's design or construction. The kind of problems that couldn't be fixed with adjustments or software patches. But Jack didn't think the problem was fundamental. The pattern of symptoms he was observing suggested something much simpler. The kind of issue that experienced field mechanics encountered regularly, but that might be invisible to engineers who spent more time with computer models than actual hardware. Emma folded the photograph carefully and put it back in her backpack. "Dad, what would Mom tell you to do right now?" The question stopped Jack cold. He knew exactly what Sarah would tell him to do. She would tell him to trust his instincts, to remember that expertise wasn't about credentials or titles, but about understanding how things actually worked in the real world. She would remind him that some of the most important solutions came from people who were willing to look beyond conventional wisdom. She would tell me to stop making excuses and start making a difference, Jack admitted quietly. Then that's what you should do, Emma said with the kind of simple logic that cut through all the complex reasoning adults use to avoid taking risks. Jack looked at the aircraft, then at his daughter, then back at the increasingly desperate activity surrounding Falcon's Pride. Every instinct he'd developed over years of working with complex machinery was telling him that the solution was simpler than anyone was assuming. But stepping forward would mean exposing himself to ridicule, failure, and the kind of public humiliation that could crush what little confidence he'd managed to rebuild since leaving the Air Force. On the other hand, staying silent meant watching a problem go unsolved when he might, just might, have the key to fixing it. "What if I'm wrong?" Jack asked Emma, voicing the fear that had kept him in the shadows for too long. Emma smiled up at him with the same expression Sarah used to wear when she was about to say something that would change everything. "Dad, what if you're right?" The question hung in the desert air like a challenge, carrying with it the weight of possibilities and the promise of redemption. In the distance, Falcon's Pride sat silent, waiting for someone to understand what it was trying to say. Jack took a deep breath, tasting dust and opportunity in equal measure, and began to move toward the aircraft. Jack's movement toward the aircraft was hesitant at first, his worn work boots carrying him across the hot tarmac with the uncertain gait of a man fighting his own instincts. Emma walked beside him, her small hand clasped firmly in his, providing an anchor of courage he didn't know he possessed. The closer they got to the security perimeter, the more surreal the moment became. A small-town mechanic and his 10-year-old daughter approaching one of the most sophisticated military operations in the world. "Sir, you'll need to stay behind the barriers," called out a young airman, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio. The security detail had noticed their approach, and Jack could feel multiple sets of eyes tracking their movement. "I know," Jack replied, stopping at the rope barrier that separated spectators from the operational area, but his voice carried farther than he'd intended, cutting through the increasingly tense discussions among the technical team. Dr. Serena Cade looked up from her tablet, her expression shifting from frustrated concentration to puzzled annoyance. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, her tone carrying the barely concealed impatience of someone dealing with civilian interference during a crisis. Jack felt his throat tighten. This was exactly the moment he'd been dreading, standing before people whose intelligence and credentials far exceeded his own, about to offer an opinion on something that had stumped them completely. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to apologize, step back, and fade into the crowd before he embarrassed himself and Emma. But Emma squeezed his hand, and he found his voice. "The startup sequence isn't the problem," Jack said, his words carrying across the sudden quiet that had fallen over the immediate area. "You're getting clean diagnostics because the systems are working. The problem is in the interface between the flight computer and the engine management system." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Jack could hear his own heartbeat, the distant sound of aircraft at other parts of the base, and the whispered conversations of media crews who had noticed the unexpected civilian intervention. Colonel Stroud was the first to respond, his laugh carrying a sharp edge of derision. "Are you serious right now? We have 25 of the finest aerospace engineers in the country working on this problem, and you think you can solve it from the spectator area?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Victor," General Grant's voice cut through the colonel's mockery like a blade. The general had been watching Jack with the kind of measured attention that came from decades of evaluating people under pressure. Let the man speak. Jack felt the weight of dozens of pairs of eyes settling on him. Engineers, technicians, media representatives, and military officials, all focusing their attention on the civilian mechanic who had dared to interrupt their crisis. The pressure was overwhelming, but Emma's presence beside him provided a steady reminder of why he was here. "The engine control units are receiving the startup commands," Jack continued, his voice growing stronger as he settled into the familiar rhythm of technical diagnosis. "But there's a delay between the command being sent and the ECU acknowledging receipt. That delay is outside normal parameters, so the flight computer assumes the command failed and aborts the sequence. Dr. Cade's expression had shifted from annoyance to sharp attention. How could you possibly know that from watching the external startup sequence? The navigation lights, Jack replied, pointing toward Falcon's Pride's wingtips. They flicker in a specific pattern during each attempt. That's not random. It's the flight computer cycling through its fault detection routine. I've seen similar patterns in F-16 systems when there's a timing mismatch between subsystems. Marcus Chen emerged from beneath the aircraft, his face streaked with sweat and frustration. The timing parameters are all within specification, he said, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there an hour ago. Specification for what? Jack asked gently. Laboratory conditions or field operations? Because heat expansion can introduce microsecond delays in fiber optic connections, and if your timing windows are narrow enough, that could be enough to trigger fault detection. The technical area fell completely silent. Jack could see Marcus Chen's expression changing as he processed the implications of what Jack had just suggested. Dr. Cade was scrolling rapidly through screens on her tablet, her fingers moving with the precise urgency of someone checking calculations. Jesus, Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. The environmental compensation algorithms, we calibrated them for optimal laboratory temperature, not desert heat. Colonel Stroud's face had gone through several color changes, settling on a shade that suggested he was realizing his earlier mockery might have been premature. That's impossible. Our systems are designed to operate in all environmental conditions. Designed to, yes, Jack agreed respectfully. But if the initial calibration was done under controlled conditions, and the field compensation software wasn't properly tested under thermal stress, you'd get exactly this kind of failure. Everything works perfectly until you try to actually use it. General Grant stepped closer to the barrier, his weathered face showing the first sign of hope Jack had seen since the demonstration began. Mr. Rylan. Jack Rylan. Jack straightened unconsciously, muscle memory from his military days bringing his shoulders back and his chin up. Mr. Rylan, are you suggesting that our $100 million aircraft is failing to start because it's too hot outside? Not too hot, sir. Just hotter than it was when the control systems were calibrated. The hardware can handle the temperature. It's the software timing that's off. Emma tugged on Jack's sleeve, and when he looked down, she whispered, Dad, they're all staring at you. She was right. The entire technical team, the media crews, the military officials. Everyone in the immediate area was focused on the civilian mechanic who had just diagnosed a problem that had stumped some of the finest engineering minds in the country. Dr. Cade closed her tablet with a sharp snap. If you're right about this, the fix would require recalibrating the environmental compensation parameters and adjusting the timing windows in the flight control software. Yes, ma'am, Jack replied. It's not a hardware problem, it's a software configuration issue. Should take about 20 minutes to implement, assuming you have access to the system parameters. Colonel Stroud was staring at Jack with an expression that mixed disbelief with something that might have been embarrassment. And you determine this by watching our startup attempts? By listening to them, sir. Every system has a signature sound when it's working properly, and a different signature when it's not. The Falcon's Pride sounds like a system that's trying to do what you're asking, but getting confused about timing. General Grant was quiet for a long moment, studying Jack with the kind of intense scrutiny that made seasoned airmen nervous. Finally, he spoke. Dr. Cade, how long would it take to test Mr. Rylan's theory? If he's right, we could have new parameters loaded in 15 minutes, she replied, her earlier skepticism now replaced by the focused energy of someone who had found a promising solution. And if he's wrong? Then we've lost 15 minutes and we're back where we started. The general nodded slowly, then looked directly at Jack. Mr. Rylan, I'm going to ask you to step inside that security perimeter. If you're wrong about this, you'll have wasted the time of some very important people. If you're right, he paused, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Well, let's see if you're right first. As the security barrier was lifted and Jack stepped into the operational area, Emma's proud smile was the last thing he saw before the technical team surrounded him with questions, tablets, and the kind of focused attention he hadn't experienced since his Air Force days. The real test was about to begin. The operational area around Falcon's Pride buzzed with renewed energy as Jack found himself at the center of controlled chaos. Dr. Serena Cade led him toward the aircraft's open access panels, her tablet displaying cascades of diagnostic data that had meant nothing an hour ago but now might hold the key to salvation. The environmental compensation parameters are buried deep in the flight control architecture, Serena explained as they walked, her earlier skepticism replaced by the focused intensity of an engineer pursuing a promising lead. If you're right about the timing delays, we'll need to access the core system files. Jack nodded, his mind already shifting into the diagnostic mode that had served him well during countless hours maintaining military aircraft. The closer he got to Falcon's Pride, the more familiar the environment became, the smell of avgas and hydraulic fluid, the organized complexity of cutting-edge aerospace technology, the quiet urgency of technicians who knew that every minute counted. "Dad's going to fix the airplane," Emma announced to anyone within earshot, her voice carrying the unshakable confidence that only children possessed. Several technicians smiled despite the tension, and Jack felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the desert heat. Marcus Chen approached with a laptop and a bundle of diagnostic cables, his expression mixing hope with residual frustration. "The system architecture is completely different from older aircraft," he warned Jack. "The interfaces are all software-defined, and the timing parameters are managed by machine learning algorithms." "The principles are the same," Jack replied, accepting the laptop and examining the connection ports on Falcon's Pride's fuselage. "Engines need fuel, air, and ignition in the right sequence. Everything else is just about making sure the signals get where they need to go when they need to be there." As Jack connected the diagnostic cables, he became aware of the crowd that had gathered around them. Media crews were positioning cameras to capture every movement, military officials were watching with barely concealed anxiety, and international observers were taking notes that would undoubtedly appear in intelligence reports. The pressure was enormous, but Jack found himself settling into the familiar rhythm of methodical troubleshooting. "Can you show me the startup sequence timing?" Jack asked, his fingers moving across the laptop keyboard with more confidence than he'd felt in years. The interface was indeed different from the systems he'd worked on in the Air Force, but the underlying logic was reassuringly familiar. Serena pulled up a series of timing diagrams on her tablet, showing the cascade of signals that should occur during engine startup. Each subsystem has a specific window to respond to commands. If any subsystem falls outside its window, the entire sequence aborts. Jack studied the diagrams, his mind automatically calculating the cumulative effect of small timing delays. "What's the ambient temperature differential between your laboratory calibration and current field conditions?" Marcus checked his environmental readings. "About 18 degrees Celsius higher than lab conditions. And the fiber optic cable runs between the flight computer and engine control units. How long are they?" "Approximately 15 meters for the primary runs, with several junction boxes for signal conditioning." Jack felt the familiar satisfaction of pieces falling into place. "There's your problem. Fiber optic transmission speeds are temperature dependent. At higher temperatures, signal propagation slows down by microseconds. Your timing windows are probably calibrated to laboratory conditions, so the field delays are pushing responses outside acceptable parameters." Colonel Stroud had been watching from a few feet away, his expression cycling between skepticism and grudging interest. "Are you telling me that a $100 million aircraft is grounded because the cables are running too slow?" "Not too slow, sir," Jack replied diplomatically. "Just slower than the software expects them to be. It's actually a testament to how precise the timing requirements are. The delays we're talking about are measured in microseconds." Emma had found a shaded spot near the aircraft's landing gear where she could watch the proceedings without getting in anyone's way. She'd pulled out a small notebook and was carefully writing down everything she heard, occasionally looking up to flash encouraging smiles at her father. "All right," Serena said, pulling up a configuration screen on her tablet. "If you're right, we need to adjust the timing tolerance windows for environmental compensation. The parameters are protected, but I have administrative access." Jack studied the configuration screen, his mind working through the implications of each setting. "The startup sequence timing. Can you show me the specific windows for engine control unit acknowledgement?" The screen changed to display a series of timing parameters, each measured in microseconds. Jack could see immediately that the tolerances were extremely tight, precise enough for laboratory conditions, but potentially inadequate for field operations under thermal stress. Try increasing the acknowledgement windows by 50 microseconds, Jack suggested. That should compensate for the temperature-induced delays without compromising system safety. 50 microseconds seems like a lot, Marcus observed, though he was already making notes on his laptop. It's less than the blink of an eye, Jack replied. But in computer timing, it's enough to make the difference between success and failure. As Serena began implementing the parameter changes, Jack found himself drawn into the familiar routine of system modification and testing. Other technicians gathered around, offering insights and asking questions that demonstrated their respect for his analysis. For the first time in years, Jack felt like he was where he belonged, surrounded by complex machinery and people who understood that solving problems required both technical knowledge and intuitive understanding. Parameters updated, Serena announced, ready for test startup sequence. The area around Falcon's Pride fell silent as everyone positioned themselves for the critical test. Jack stepped back from the aircraft, his hand finding Emma's as she moved to stand beside him. The weight of the moment settled over the airfield like a blanket. Careers, reputations, and national prestige all balanced on the performance of systems that Jack had just modified based on his analysis of environmental factors. General Grant positioned himself where he could observe both the aircraft and the technical team. Dr. Cade, you may proceed when ready. Serena took a deep breath, her finger hovering over the startup initiation command, initiating startup sequence with modified environmental parameters. The first signs were promising. Status lights illuminated in the familiar cascade that indicated normal system initialization. But Jack found himself holding his breath as the sequence reached the critical point where previous attempts had failed. The engine control units responded to their initialization commands. Acknowledgement signals returned within the modified timing windows. The startup sequence continued beyond the point where it had previously aborted. And then, for the first time that day, Falcon's Pride's engines began to turn. The sound started as a whisper, barely audible above the ambient noise of the airfield. But it grew steadily, building into the characteristic whine of turbofan engines coming to life. Status lights shifted from amber to green as systems came online in proper sequence. Jack felt Emma's hand squeeze his as the engine noise built to a steady rumble. Around them, the technical team was cheering, media crews were capturing every moment, and military officials were allowing themselves to smile for the first time all day. But as the engines settled into their idle configuration, Jack noticed something that made his heart sink. The sound wasn't quite right. There was a subtle irregularity in the engine note that suggested the startup sequence, while successful, wasn't completely stable. His worst fears were confirmed when the engines suddenly wound down, returning Falcon's Pride to its previous state of expensive silence. The cheers died away as quickly as they had begun, replaced by the heavy weight of partial success that somehow felt worse than complete failure. The silence that followed the engine shutdown was deafening. After the brief moment of triumph, watching Falcon's Pride return to its dormant state felt like watching hope die in real time. Jack stared at the aircraft, his mind racing through possibilities while the technical team around him struggled to process what had just happened. "We achieved startup," Dr. Serena Cade said slowly, her voice carrying a mixture of vindication and confusion. The environmental parameters were correct. But something caused the engines to abort during idle stabilization. Jack was already moving toward the diagnostic station, his mechanical instincts overriding the disappointment that threatened to overwhelm him. The startup sequence worked because we fixed the timing issue, but there's something else. Something that only becomes apparent once the engines are actually running. Marcus Chen was frantically scrolling through diagnostic data on his laptop, his expression growing more frustrated by the second. All systems show nominal during the startup phase. Engine parameters were within acceptable ranges. The shutdown appears to have been initiated by the flight computer, but I can't determine why. Colonel Stroud stepped forward, his earlier grudging respect now tinged with renewed skepticism. "So we're back where we started. The engines start, but they won't stay running." "No, sir," Jack replied, his attention focused on the laptop screen displaying engine telemetry. "We're further along than we were." The timing fix proved that the basic systems work. "This is a different problem." something related to engine operation rather than initialization. Emma had moved closer to her father, sensing his frustration and determination in equal measure. "Dad, you fix the first part. You can fix this part too." Her simple confidence was both heartwarming and terrifying. Jack could feel the weight of expectations from dozens of people who were now looking to him for solutions he wasn't sure he could provide. The successful diagnosis of the timing issue had established his credibility, but it had also raised the stakes exponentially. "Can you show me the engine parameter readings during the shutdown sequence?" Jack asked Marcus, who immediately pulled up the relevant data. The graphs displayed on the laptop screen told a story that Jack was beginning to recognize. Engine temperatures, fuel flow rates, and electrical system parameters all appeared normal during startup, but there were subtle fluctuations that became more pronounced as the engines approached operational temperature. There, Jack pointed to a series of small spikes in the electrical system readings. "See how the power draw fluctuates right before shutdown? That's not normal engine behavior. That's the flight computer fighting with something." Serena leaned over to examine the data, her engineering mind immediately grasping the implications. "You're suggesting there's an electrical interference issue that only manifests during engine operation?" "Something like that," Jack replied, though he wasn't entirely certain yet. "In my experience, intermittent electrical problems are usually related to grounding issues or electromagnetic interference. But with systems this complex, it could be more subtle." The technical team gathered around the diagnostic station, their earlier confidence now replaced by the methodical determination of engineers faced with a multi-layered problem. Jack found himself at the center of their discussions, offering insights based on his field experience, while learning about the advanced systems that were beyond his direct knowledge. "The electromagnetic signature of the hybrid propulsion system is completely different from conventional engines," Marcus explained. "The electric motor components generate significant electromagnetic fields that could potentially interfere with sensitive electronics." Jack nodded, his mind working through the possibilities. "What about the shielding around the flight computer and engine control units? Is it designed to handle the specific electromagnetic profile of this propulsion system?" The question prompted a flurry of activity as technicians began examining shielding specifications and electromagnetic compatibility testing data. Jack watched their work with growing concern. The more they discovered, the more complex the problem appeared to be. "Dad," Emma said quietly, tugging on his sleeve, "you're making that worried face again." Jack knelt down to her level, aware that their conversation was being observed by media crews and military officials who were probably wondering why a 10-year-old girl was present during such a critical technical discussion. "Sometimes problems have more than one layer, sweetheart," he explained gently. "We fixed the first layer, but now we have to figure out the second layer. Like when our washing machine was making that weird noise, and you had to fix the belt and then fix the thing that was making the belt slip?" "Exactly like that," Jack smiled, once again amazed by his daughter's ability to find simple analogies for complex situations. As Jack stood up, he noticed General Grant approaching with the measured pace of someone who had been observing from a distance, but was now ready to engage directly. "Mr. Rylan," the general said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making critical decisions under pressure, "your analysis of the timing issue was correct, and we're grateful for that insight. But I need to ask, do you believe this second problem is within your ability to diagnose?" The question was fair, and Jack appreciated the general's direct approach. "Sir, I think the electromagnetic interference theory is sound, but validating it and developing a solution is going to require equipment and expertise I don't have. I can offer insights based on field experience, but the actual fix is going to need your engineering team." "Then let's make sure your insights are heard," Grant replied. "Dr. Cade, Mr. Rylan has proven his diagnostic abilities. I want him involved in whatever comes next." Serena nodded, though Jack could see she was struggling with the implications of relying on civilian input for such a critical military system. "We'll need to conduct electromagnetic compatibility testing under operational conditions. That means running the engines while monitoring for interference patterns." "How long will that take?" Colonel Stroud asked, his voice carrying the tension of someone aware that every minute of delay was being broadcast to international audiences. "Several hours, minimum," Marcus replied. "We'll need to set up specialized monitoring equipment and run multiple test sequences to isolate the interference sources." Jack felt a familiar weight settling on his shoulders. the pressure of a complex problem that required both time and expertise to solve properly. But as he looked at Emma's encouraging smile and the expectant faces of the technical team, he realized that this moment represented more than just fixing an aircraft. It was about proving that experience and intuition still had value in a world increasingly dominated by computer models and theoretical analysis. "Let's get started," Jack said simply, his voice carrying the quiet determination that had once made him one of the Air Force's most reliable mechanics. As the technical team began preparing for the electromagnetic testing procedures, Jack found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. From the grief and uncertainty that had followed Sarah's death to the quiet satisfaction of running his small-town garage, every experience had contributed to the insights that were now being applied to one of the most advanced aircraft ever built. The repair struggle was far from over, but for the first time in years, Jack felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The electromagnetic testing equipment arrived with military efficiency, specialized monitoring devices, spectrum analyzers, and shielding diagnostic tools that transformed the area around Falcon's Pride into something resembling a high-tech laboratory. Jack watched the setup with a mixture of fascination and growing anxiety. The complexity of the equipment was far beyond anything he'd worked with in his Air Force days. Yet the fundamental principles remained the same. Find the source of interference and eliminate it. Dr. Serena Cade coordinated the testing protocol with the precision of someone who had spent years managing complex technical operations. "We'll monitor electromagnetic emissions across all frequency ranges during startup and idle operations," she explained to the assembled team. "If there's interference between the hybrid propulsion system and the flight computers, we should be able to isolate it." Jack positioned himself where he could observe both the monitoring equipment and the aircraft itself. His diagnostic approach had always relied as much on visual and auditory cues as on instrument readings, and he wasn't about to abandon that methodology now. "Dad, all those machines look really complicated," Emma observed, her voice carrying a note of concern that hadn't been there earlier. The growing complexity of the situation was beginning to penetrate even her childlike confidence in her father's abilities. "They are complicated, sweetheart," Jack admitted, kneeling down beside her. "But sometimes complicated problems need complicated tools to solve them. The important thing is understanding what the tools are telling you." Marcus Chen finished connecting the final monitoring cables and looked up from his laptop. "All diagnostic systems are online. We're ready to attempt startup with full electromagnetic monitoring." General Grant positioned himself where he could observe the entire operation. The weight of command was visible in his posture. This demonstration had already consumed far more time and resources than anyone had anticipated, and the international implications of continued failure were becoming increasingly serious. "Dr. Cade, proceed when ready," quote, Grant ordered, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had made critical decisions under pressure for decades. Serena initiated the startup sequence using the modified environmental parameters that Jack had suggested earlier. The familiar cascade of system initialization began, and this time Jack was able to watch the electromagnetic monitoring displays as each subsystem came online. The startup proceeded normally through the initial phases, with electromagnetic emissions staying within expected parameters. Jack found himself holding his breath as the sequence approached the critical point where previous attempts had succeeded briefly before failing. The engines spun up successfully, their whine building to the characteristic rumble of turbofan operation. Status lights across Falcon's Pride's fuselage shifted to green as systems reported normal operation. For several minutes, it appeared that the electromagnetic testing had somehow solved the problem simply by providing better monitoring of system interactions. Then the irregularities began. "I'm seeing frequency spikes in the 2.4 GHz range," Marcus reported, his voice tight with concentration as he watched cascading data on multiple screens. "The interference appears to be intermittent, but increasing in amplitude." Jack could hear the engine note changing before the instruments detected it, a subtle shift in the harmonic frequency that suggested the flight computer was beginning to struggle with conflicting signals. The electromagnetic interference was building slowly, like a feedback loop that took time to reach critical levels. "There," Jack pointed to one of the monitoring displays where a pattern was emerging. "The interference isn't constant. It's building up as the engines reach operating temperature. Something in the hybrid system is generating electromagnetic noise that gets worse with thermal load." The engines continued to run, but Jack could see the flight computer's status indicators beginning to show warnings. The electromagnetic interference was approaching levels that would trigger safety shutdowns, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop the progression. 30 seconds to automatic shutdown, Serena announced, her voice carrying the frustration of someone watching a problem unfold with complete clarity but no immediate solution. Colonel Stroud stepped forward, his expression cycling through anger, embarrassment, and what might have been panic. Can we override the safety systems? Force the engines to keep running despite the interference? No, sir, Marcus replied immediately. The safety shutdowns are hardwired into the system architecture. Overriding them would require fundamental software modifications that could take weeks to implement and test. Jack watched the countdown displays with growing desperation. They were so close to understanding the problem, but understanding wasn't the same as solving it. The electromagnetic interference was real, measurable, and predictable, but it was also built into the fundamental design of the hybrid propulsion system. 15 seconds to shut down, Serena called out. Emma tugged on Jack's sleeve, her face showing the kind of worry that children displayed when they sensed that the adults around them were running out of options. Dad, can you still fix it? The question hit Jack like a physical blow. His daughter's unwavering faith in his abilities had carried him this far, but now he was facing a problem that seemed to require engineering solutions beyond his capabilities. The electromagnetic interference wasn't something that could be fixed with intuition and field experience. It required fundamental changes to systems he didn't fully understand. 10 seconds to shut down. Jack's mind raced through everything he'd observed during the testing process. The interference patterns, the thermal correlation, the timing of the failures. There had to be something they were missing, some simple factor that was being overlooked amid the complexity of the advanced monitoring systems. 5 seconds. And then, in the final moments before shutdown, Jack heard something that made his blood run cold. Beneath the steady rumble of the engines, there was a subtle harmonic resonance that he recognized from his Air Force days, the characteristic sound of loose connections under electrical load. 4 seconds. Wait! Jack shouted, but it was too late. The engines wound down as the flight computer initiated its safety shutdown sequence, returning Falcon's Pride to its silent state. The electromagnetic monitoring systems continued to record data for several seconds after engine shutdown, capturing the dissipation patterns of the interference that had caused the failure. The silence that followed was oppressive. After coming so close to success, watching the aircraft fail again felt like a personal defeat for everyone involved. Jack could see the disappointment in the faces around him. Technicians who had worked frantically to implement solutions, engineers who had committed their reputations to the success of the project, and military officials who faced the prospect of explaining another failure to international observers. But Jack's mind was still processing what he had heard in those final seconds. The harmonic resonance hadn't been coming from the hybrid propulsion system. It had been coming from somewhere else entirely, somewhere that conventional electromagnetic monitoring wouldn't necessarily detect. Dr. Cade, Jack said quietly, his voice cutting through the disappointed murmurs of the technical team, I need to look at something. Serena looked up from her tablet, her expression showing the kind of weary patience that came from dealing with too many variables and not enough solutions. What is it, Mr. Rylan? The electromagnetic interference. I don't think it's coming from the hybrid system itself. I think it's coming from a loose ground connection that's creating an antenna effect under thermal load. The suggestion prompted a moment of silence as the engineering team processed the implications. Marcus Chen was the first to respond, his voice carrying a note of skeptical interest. A grounding issue could theoretically create electromagnetic radiation, but our grounding systems were thoroughly tested during development. Tested under laboratory conditions, Jack replied, unconsciously echoing his earlier analysis of the timing parameters. But thermal expansion could create microfractures in ground connections that wouldn't be apparent during static testing. Colonel Stroud's expression had shifted from disappointment to barely concealed irritation. Mr. Rylan, you've already identified one problem correctly, and we're grateful for that. But now you're suggesting that our ground systems, which were designed and tested by the best engineers in the industry, are somehow defective? Jack felt the familiar weight of self-doubt settling on his shoulders. Maybe he was overreaching, trying to solve problems beyond his expertise. Maybe the harmonic resonance he'd heard was just wishful thinking, the desperate imagination of someone who wanted to help but lacked the knowledge to do so effectively. But Emma's hand slipped into his, and he heard her whisper, "Dad, you know what you heard." She was right. He did know what he'd heard, and it was the sound of electrical current finding an unintended path through metal structures, the characteristic signature of a grounding problem that became apparent only under specific operational conditions. "Sir," Jack said to Colonel Stroud, his voice carrying the quiet confidence that had once made him one of the Air Force's most trusted mechanics, "I'm not questioning anyone's competence. I'm suggesting that some problems only become apparent under field conditions that can't be replicated in laboratory testing." General Grant had been listening to the exchange with the measured attention of someone weighing multiple factors. "Mr. Rylan, how would we test your theory about the grounding system?" "Visual inspection of all ground connections, looking for signs of thermal stress or microfractures. It would take about an hour to check the primary ground points, and if I'm right, we should find at least one connection that shows signs of intermittent contact under thermal load." The general nodded slowly, his decision-making process visible in his expression. "Dr. Cade, we've come this far based on Mr. Ryland's insights. I think we owe it to everyone involved to test this theory as well." As the technical team began preparing for a comprehensive inspection of Falcon's Pride's grounding systems, Jack found himself hoping that his instincts were correct. Because if they weren't, he would have led everyone down another dead end, consuming more time and resources while the world watched America's technological capabilities being questioned in real time. The stakes had never been higher, and everything depended on whether a loose connection, something as simple as a fractured wire, was hiding beneath the complexity of one of the most advanced aircraft ever built. The inspection of Falcon's Pride's grounding system began with systematic precision, but Jack could feel the underlying tension radiating from everyone involved. Time was running out. The media crews were growing restless, international observers were making increasingly frequent phone calls, and the afternoon sun was casting longer shadows across the airfield. Jack crawled beneath the aircraft's fuselage alongside Marcus Chen, their flashlights illuminating the complex network of cables, connections, and structural elements that formed the backbone of the aircraft's electrical system. The space was cramped and uncomfortably warm, but Jack felt more at home here than he had anywhere else in years. "The primary ground connections all appear visually normal," Marcus reported, his voice echoing off the metal surfaces surrounding them. "No obvious signs of corrosion or physical damage." Jack was examining a junction box near the engine mounting points when he saw it, a hairline crack in the metal housing, where thermal expansion had created a stress fracture so small it was barely visible to the naked eye. "Marcus, bring your light over here." The fracture was subtle, but under close examination with proper lighting, it became clear that the junction box had developed a microcrack that would intermittently break the electrical connection under thermal stress. As the engines heated up during operation, thermal expansion would widen the crack just enough to create an intermittent ground fault. "Jesus," Marcus whispered, his engineer's mind immediately grasping the implications. An intermittent ground fault in that location would create exactly the kind of electromagnetic interference we've been seeing. The entire junction box would act like an antenna, radiating electromagnetic noise directly into the flight computer's frequency range. Above them, Jack could hear Dr. Serena Cade's voice as Marcus radioed their discovery to the surface team. "Confirmed ground fault in junction box GJ47. Thermal stress fracture causing intermittent connection under operational load." The response was immediate and electric. Jack could hear excited conversations, the rapid movement of technicians, and the kind of focused energy that came when a long-sought solution finally presented itself. As he and Marcus crawled out from beneath the aircraft, Jack found himself facing a semicircle of expectant faces. "How long to repair the connection?" General Grant asked, his voice carrying the controlled urgency of someone who could see the finish line but knew that execution was everything. 20 minutes, Marcus replied confidently. "We have spare junction boxes in our repair kit. It's a standard replacement procedure." Emma had been waiting near the aircraft's landing gear, and she ran to Jack as soon as he emerged from beneath the fuselage. "Dad, did you find the problem?" "We found it, sweetheart," Jack replied, lifting her up so she could see the activity around them. "It was exactly what I thought. A loose connection that only caused problems when the engines got hot." Colonel Stroud approached with an expression that mixed relief with what might have been grudging respect. "Mr. Rylan, if this repair resolves the issue, I owe you an apology for my earlier skepticism." "No apology necessary, sir," Jack replied diplomatically. "Skepticism is healthy when you're dealing with systems this complex. The important thing is that we found the problem." The repair proceeded with military efficiency. Marcus and his team replaced the fractured junction box with movements that spoke of extensive training and experience. Jack watched from nearby, offering occasional insights but mostly staying out of the way as the experts applied their specialized knowledge to implement the solution he had identified. Dr. Cade coordinated the final system checks with the same precision she had brought to the earlier diagnostic efforts. All ground connections verified. Electromagnetic monitoring systems ready. Flight computers showing all systems nominal. The crowd around Falcon's Pride had grown during the repair process. Word of the potential solution had spread throughout the airfield, and now military personnel, contractors, and media representatives formed a large semicircle around the aircraft. The pressure was immense. This wasn't just another test. It was the culmination of hours of public troubleshooting that had been broadcast to audiences around the world. "Emma," Jack said quietly, "this is the real test. Are you ready?" His daughter nodded with the kind of serious determination that reminded him powerfully of her mother. "I am ready, Dad. Are you?" Jack took a deep breath, tasting the familiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety that had characterized every important moment of his military career. "I'm ready." General Grant positioned himself where he could observe both the aircraft and the assembled crowd. "Dr. Cade, you may initiate the final test sequence." The startup process began with the same systematic progression that had characterized the earlier attempts. But this time Jack could sense a different quality to the proceedings. The electromagnetic monitoring systems showed clean readings as each subsystem came online. The timing parameters remained within the modified windows that had solved the earlier problem. And most importantly, the grounding system maintained stable connections as thermal loads increased. The engines spun up smoothly, their characteristic whine building to operational levels without the subtle irregularities that had marked the previous attempts. Status lights across Falcon's Pride's fuselage remained steadily green as systems reported normal operation. "Electromagnetic emissions within normal parameters," Marcus reported, his voice carrying barely contained excitement. "No interference detected across all monitored frequencies." The engines continued to run as minutes passed. First 5, then 10, then 15. The sound was clean and steady, the harmonic signature of perfectly balanced turbofan operation. Jack could see the tension slowly draining from the faces around him as it became clear that this time was different. 30 minutes of stable operation, Serena announced, her voice carrying the kind of controlled elation that came from watching years of work finally achieve its intended result. All systems nominal, engine parameters stable across all operational ranges. The cheers began slowly, starting with the technical team and spreading outward through the assembled crowd. Jack found himself surrounded by congratulations, handshakes, and the kind of recognition he hadn't experienced since his Air Force days. But the moment that mattered most was Emma's proud smile as she looked up at him with the unshakable confidence that had carried them both through this extraordinary day. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Grant's voice carried across the airfield through the public address system, "I'm pleased to announce that Falcon's Pride has achieved stable operational status. This success represents not only advanced aerospace technology, but also the value of experienced insight and collaborative problem-solving." The media crews captured every moment as Falcon's Pride continued its steady operation, the sound of its engines now representing triumph rather than frustration. International observers were making notes that would undoubtedly reflect positively on American technological capabilities. And in the middle of it all, Jack Rylan stood with his daughter, watching an aircraft that embodied the future, while reflecting on a journey that had brought him full circle from his military past to an unexpected moment of redemption. But the greatest moment was yet to come, as General Grant began walking toward Jack with an expression that suggested the day's surprises weren't over yet. General Grant approached through the celebrating crowd with the measured pace of someone who understood the weight of symbolic gestures. His weathered face carried an expression of respect that Jack hadn't seen directed toward him since his Air Force days, and the conversations around them gradually quieted as people recognized that something significant was about to happen. "Mr. Rylan," the general said, his voice carrying across the suddenly hushed airfield, "step forward, please." Jack felt his heart racing as he moved toward the general, Emma's hand clasped firmly in his. The crowd formed a natural semicircle around them, with media cameras capturing every moment and military personnel standing at informal attention. The weight of the moment was overwhelming, not just the successful repair of Falcon's pride, but the recognition of worth that Jack had thought he'd lost forever. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Grant announced, his voice projecting the authority of someone accustomed to addressing large assemblies, "today we've witnessed something remarkable when our most advanced aircraft systems failed. When our best engineers and technicians reached the limits of conventional diagnosis, a civilian mechanic from a small town stepped forward with insights that proved invaluable." Jack could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes focused on him, and for a moment the attention was almost paralyzing. But Emma squeezed his hand, and he found strength in her presence beside him. Mr. Rylan identified not one but two critical problems that our standard diagnostic procedures had missed, the general continued. His analysis of environmental timing factors and grounding system failures demonstrated the kind of practical expertise that comes from years of hands-on experience with complex machinery. Dr. Serena Cade stepped forward from the crowd, her earlier skepticism completely replaced by genuine respect. "Jack, I owe you more than an apology. I've spent years working with theoretical models and computer simulations, but you showed me the value of listening to what machines are actually telling us. Your diagnostic skills are extraordinary." The acknowledgement from someone of Serena's caliber meant more to Jack than he could express. Throughout his career, he'd often felt that his intuitive approach to mechanical problems was somehow less valuable than formal engineering knowledge. To have that approach validated by one of the most brilliant aerospace engineers in the country was profoundly meaningful. Marcus Chen emerged from the crowd as well, carrying something in his hands. "Jack, this is the fractured junction box that was causing our problems. I had it mounted as a reminder that sometimes the most sophisticated systems fail for the simplest reasons. I'd like you to have it." Jack accepted the small metal component, feeling its weight in his palm. Such a tiny thing to have caused such enormous problems, yet its discovery had required exactly the kind of field experience that he'd accumulated over years of working with aircraft under real-world conditions. Colonel Stroud approached with an expression that mixed genuine respect with what was clearly difficult humility. "Mr. Rylan, I owe you a significant apology. My skepticism was unprofessional and unfounded. Your expertise proved invaluable when our conventional approaches failed." "Thank you, sir," Jack replied simply. "But this was a team effort. Everyone here contributed to the solution." Emma looked up at her father with shining eyes. "Dad, tell them about Mom." The suggestion caught Jack off guard, but as he looked at his daughter's encouraging face, he realized she was right. This moment wasn't just about mechanical expertise, it was about the journey that had brought him here, including the loss that had shaped his perspective on what truly mattered. "My late wife Sarah always believed that every person has value, regardless of their circumstances," Jack said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "She taught me that expertise comes in many forms, and that solutions often come from unexpected places. Today proved that she was right." General Grant nodded slowly, his expression showing that he understood the deeper implications of what Jack had shared. "Mr. Rylan, throughout my career, I've learned that the military's greatest strength isn't our technology or our weapons. It's our people. Today, you reminded us that expertise and dedication don't disappear when someone changes uniforms." The general stepped back slightly, and Jack suddenly realized what was about to happen. The crowd seemed to sense it too, falling into complete silence as General Grant raised his right hand in the crisp, precise salute that represented the highest form of military respect. The salute was held for several long seconds, and Jack found himself automatically returning it with the muscle memory that never truly faded from military service. Around them, every person in uniform, from junior technicians to senior officers, joined in the salute, creating a moment of recognition that transcended rank and protocol. Emma watched with wide eyes as her father received the honor that his expertise had earned. The sight of dozens of military personnel saluting the man she'd always known as simply Dad was validation of everything she'd believed about his capabilities. When the salutes were finally lowered, General Grant extended his hand to Jack. "Mr. Rylan, I'd like to offer you a consulting position with our Advanced Systems Diagnostic team. Your insights could prove invaluable for future aircraft development programs." The offer was unexpected and generous, representing not just employment, but professional recognition at the highest levels. Jack looked down at Emma, whose enthusiastic nod made her opinion clear. "General, I'm honored by the offer," Jack replied. "I'd like to accept, with the understanding that my daughter and I are a package deal. She's been my inspiration throughout this entire process." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Grant smiled, looking down at Emma with the kind of warmth that suggested he understood the importance of family in sustaining professional excellence. The media crews captured every moment of the exchange, but Jack barely noticed them. The real audience was Emma, whose proud smile represented everything he'd been working toward since Sarah's death. The restoration of purpose, the recognition of worth, and the proof that redemption was possible even after the darkest times. As the formal ceremonies concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Jack found himself standing beside Falcon's Pride, listening to the steady rumble of engines that now represented not just technological achievement but personal triumph. The aircraft that had seemed so impossibly complex that morning now felt familiar, its systems understandable, its problems solvable. "Dad," Emma said as they prepared to leave the airfield, "Mom would be really proud of you today." "She'd be proud of both of us, sweetheart," Jack replied, looking back at the aircraft that had changed everything. Today we learned that sometimes the most important solutions come from the most unexpected places. As they walked away from Falcon's Pride, hand in hand, Jack carried with him not just the memory of a successful repair, but the knowledge that expertise, once earned, never truly disappeared. It simply waited for the right moment to prove its value once again. The desert sun was setting behind the mountains as Jack and Emma walked quietly away from the bustling activity that still surrounded Falcon's Pride. The media crews were conducting interviews, military officials were briefing international observers, and technicians were performing final system checks on the aircraft that had become the center of global attention. But for Jack and his daughter, the day's most important moments had already passed. Emma carried the small, mounted junction box that Marcus Chen had given to Jack, turning it over in her hands with the careful attention she reserved for truly important objects. "Dad, is this really what caused all those problems?" "That little crack right there." Jack pointed to the hairline fracture that was barely visible in the fading light. "Sometimes the biggest problems have the smallest causes. Your mom used to say that life was like that too. Small kindnesses could solve the biggest heartaches." They paused at Jack's old pickup truck, its faded paint and dented tailgate a stark contrast to the gleaming military vehicles surrounding them. 3 years ago, Jack would have felt embarrassed by the comparison. Today, he felt proud of the honest work that truck represented and the journey it had carried them on. "Mr. Rylan." Dr. Serena Cade jogged toward them across the tarmac, her professional composure replaced by the kind of genuine warmth that comes after sharing an extraordinary experience. "I'm glad I caught you before you left." She handed Jack a business card with her direct contact information. "I meant what I said earlier about learning from your approach. I'd like to stay in touch if you're amenable. There might be opportunities for collaboration on future projects." Jack studied the card, feeling the weight of possibilities it represented. "Dr. Cade, I appreciate that more than you know. I'm not sure what I have to offer to someone of your caliber, but I'd be honored to help however I can. Please, call me Serena. And you have more to offer than you realize." Today proved that theoretical knowledge and practical experience need each other. The best solutions come from combining both perspectives. Emma stepped forward with the kind of directness that only children possessed. "My dad is really good at fixing things. He could probably help you fix lots of airplanes." Serena smiled, kneeling down to Emma's level. "I think your dad could help us with much more than airplanes. He has a gift for seeing problems that the rest of us miss." As Serena returned to the continuing activities around Falcon's Pride, Jack helped Emma into the truck and settled into the driver's seat. The familiar environment of his old pickup felt surreal after the high-tech complexity of the day's events. The worn upholstery, the radio that only picked up AM stations, the temperature gauge that stuck slightly, all reminders of the simple life he'd built after leaving the Air Force. "Dad, are we going to move to the Air Force Base?" Emma asked as they drove away from Edwards, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. Jack had been wondering the same thing. General Grant's consulting offer represented opportunities he'd never imagined possible, but it also meant changes that would affect both of their lives. "What would you think about that, sweetheart?" Emma was quiet for several minutes, watching the desert landscape pass by their windows. "I think it would be exciting, But I also like our house and my school and Mrs. Patterson next door who gives me cookies. Those are all important things, Jack agreed. Maybe we can find a way to have both, to take on new challenges while keeping the good things we already have. The drive home gave Jack time to process everything that had happened. This morning he'd been a small-town mechanic struggling with self-doubt and the weight of unfulfilled potential. Tonight, he was returning home as someone whose expertise had been recognized at the highest levels of military aviation. The transformation was profound, but it felt earned rather than accidental. "Dad, can I ask you something?" Emma's voice was softer now, carrying the tone she used for her most important questions. "You can ask me anything, Em, you know that." "Do you think Mom knew this would happen, that you would get to be important again?" The question hit Jack harder than he'd expected. Throughout Sarah's illness, she'd maintained an unshakable faith in his abilities and potential, even when he couldn't see them himself. She'd always insisted that his talents were too valuable to remain hidden, that circumstances might change but expertise endured. "I think your mom knew that everyone has value, even when they can't see it themselves," Jack replied carefully. "She believed that the right moment would come for everyone to show what they're truly capable of." She was right, wasn't she? Yes, sweetheart. She was right. As they pulled into their driveway, Jack felt a sense of completion that had been missing from his life for years. The small house with its attached garage looked exactly the same as when they'd left that morning, but everything felt different. The tools in his garage were still the tools of a skilled mechanic, but now they carried the validation of having solved one of the most complex technical challenges in modern aviation. Emma ran ahead to unlock the front door while Jack retrieved his toolbox from the truck bed. The battered metal case had accompanied him through his Air Force career, through the difficult transition to civilian life, and now through a day that had restored his sense of professional worth. Inside were the same tools he'd carried for years, but they felt different now, not just instruments for fixing broken things, but symbols of expertise that had proven its value when it mattered most. Huntrin. The house was quiet as they settled into their evening routine. Emma spread her homework across the kitchen table, while Jack prepared dinner, both of them processing the day's events in their own ways. The normalcy was comforting after the intensity of the afternoon's activities. "Dad, when you go back to work with the Air Force people, will you still be my dad who fixes cars in the garage?" Jack paused in his dinner preparations, recognizing the deeper question behind Emma's words. She was asking whether success would change him, whether recognition would somehow alter the relationship that had sustained them both through difficult times. No matter what happens with work, I'll always be your dad first. That's the most important job I'll ever have, and success in anything else only matters if it makes me better at being your father." Emma smiled with the kind of relief that children showed when adults provided the security they needed. "Good, because I like having a dad who can fix anything." After dinner, Jack tucked Emma into bed and sat on the edge of her mattress for their traditional end-of-day conversation. Tonight, instead of reading from one of her books, Emma wanted to talk about the day's events and what they might mean for their future. "Dad, do you think we'll look back on today as the day everything changed?" Jack considered the question seriously. "I think we'll look back on today as the day we learned that nothing really changed, except our understanding of what was always true. You've always been amazing, and I've always been capable of more than I gave myself credit for. Today just proved it to everyone else." As Emma drifted off to sleep, Jack sat in his garage among the familiar tools and equipment that had defined his civilian life. The contrast between this modest space and the high-tech environment of Falcon's Pride was striking, but both represented the same fundamental truth, that problems could be solved through patience, expertise, and the willingness to look beyond conventional assumptions. General Grant's business card sat on his workbench next to the fractured junction box, two symbols of a future that seemed full of possibilities. Tomorrow would bring decisions about consulting work, potential relocation, and new challenges that would test his abilities in ways he couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, Jack Rylan was simply a father whose daughter believed in him, a mechanic whose skills had proven their worth, and a man who had learned that redemption was always possible for those willing to step forward when the moment called for it. The toolbox sat open beside him, its contents reflecting the garage's fluorescent lighting like small promises of future solutions waiting to be discovered. In the morning, there would be new problems to solve, and new opportunities to prove that expertise, once earned, never truly disappears. It simply waits for the right moment to change everything. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.